Chapter 3. The physical mechanism through which mental healing is effected continued. No one needs to be told that the nerves are the lines of communication through which the mind receives intelligence from and issues its mandates to every part of the body, but the special adaptation of the means to the ends is not so generally understood. It is not my purpose to inflict upon the reader a lengthy dissertation on the subject of the nervous system of man, but to outline a few of the salient facts which bear upon the subject of mental medicine. Before proceeding, however, to describe the structure of the nerves with reference to their functional activities as carriers of intelligence and therapeutic impulses, I desire to say one word in reference to the structure of the nervous system with reference to the theory of mental duality. Postulating a duplex mental organism, such as experimental psychology reveals, we have a logical right, a priori, to expect to find confirmatory evidence of the fact in a corresponding nervous organism. Accordingly, we find that man is endowed with two nervous systems, namely, the cerebrospinal nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. If, now, we find that the two nervous systems correspond in function to the known powers and limitations of the two minds, it will constitute conclusive proof of the correctness of the theory of mental duality. Beginning, then, with the cerebrospinal system, we know that, as its name indicates, it is presided over by the brain, the organ of the objective mind, and that it controls the voluntary movements of the body. On the other hand, the sympathetic system presides over all involuntary movements, such as nutrition, secretion, vasomotor action, reproduction, etc. Its center of functional activity is the solar plexus, sometimes called the abdominal brain. In using this term, says Dr. Robinson, I mean to convey the idea that it is endowed with the high powers and phenomena of a great nervous center, that it can organize, multiply, and diminish forces. I assume, of course, that the mental organism, which presides over the sympathetic nervous system and organizes and controls its forces, is the subjective mind. Although the dominion of that mental organism is by no means limited to the visible domain of that congeries of nerve ganglia known to empirical anatomy as the sympathetic nervous system, it necessarily presides over all the silent forces or involuntary activities of the whole physical organism, otherwise the latter could not act as a unit. Besides, the facts of psychology teach us that the subjective mind can under certain conditions, not yet very clearly defined, invade the domain and usurp the functions of the cerebrospinal system. This may be brought about experimentally, as in hypnotism or trance, induced or spontaneous, or it may occur in response to necessity, as when the body is in imminent and deadly peril. In such an emergency, the objective mind functions too slowly, and the nerve responses are correspondingly sluggish, and hence the subjective mind, ever alert for the protection of the body, instantaneously inhibits all brain mentation, seizes upon its mechanism of motion, and wields it with inconceivable rapidity and precision, often snatching the body from the very jaws of death. The difference in the action of the two minds in such cases is the difference between reason and instinct or intuition. The one requires time for deliberation, with its accompanying doubt and hesitancy. The other is instantaneous in mentation and appropriate action. Hypnotism, in this sense, is merely a method of inducing the subjective mind to inhibit the action of the brain, to the end that certain of its functions may be usurped by the subjective mind. When the inhibition is accomplished, automatism, e.g., automatic writing, etc., is rendered possible, which is but another way of saying that the mental organism which normally presides over the sympathetic nervous system has assumed temporary control of the cerebrospinal system. This constitutes one of the points of radical difference between the powers and limitations of the two minds. The subjective mind may, and does on occasion, control every nerve and muscle in the physical organism, voluntary and involuntary. But the objective mind cannot directly control one purely involuntary muscle. The far-reaching significance of this one fact cannot be dwelt upon here, but I cannot refrain from remarking, in passing, that it constitutes indubitable evidence that the subjective mind is the primary intelligence of organic life, the corollary of which is that the objective mind, with its organs, is the product of organic evolution. I make this remark for the reason that some scientists have labored to prove that the sympathetic nervous system is a subordinate offshoot of the cerebrospinal system. I have incidentally pointed out this fallacy elsewhere in discussing the facts of organic and mental evolution, the sum of which demonstrates that the subjective mind antedated the objective, or brain intelligence, by untold millions of years. That there is a nerve connection between the two nervous systems is necessarily true. That they are intimately correlated is well known and admitted by those who most strongly assert the essential independence of the sympathetic. Experimental psychology teaches us that there exists a nexus between the two minds, enabling them, under certain conditions, to act in perfect synchronism. The same reason exists for an intimate interrelation between the two nervous systems. But as the subjective mind often asserts its independence of the objective, so are the essential functions of the sympathetic ganglia independent of control by the cerebral center. They may be modified by indirection, as by suggestion, but the essential vital processes go on independently of objective will or desire. In other words, the life forces, which are presided over by the subjective mind, acting through the sympathetic nervous system, persist independently of the will or volition of the objective mind acting through the cerebrospinal nervous system. As before remarked, it is only by indirection that the latter can modify the action of the sympathetic nervous organism, and this is where the law of suggestion presents itself as a therapeutic agent. The nerve connections between the two nervous systems enable the objective mind to communicate its therapeutic suggestions to the subjective mind. The latter, ever ready to adopt whatever measures promise to preserve health and prolong life, communicates the necessary therapeutic impulses, through the nerves, to the cell intelligences which are involved in the disease, stimulating them to increased activity, or the reverse, as occasion requires, in a word, re-establishing normal metabolism in the diseased cells. In this connection, it must be remarked that the latest, most intelligent, and most comprehensive theory of disease is that a disease of the body is a disease of the cells of the body. The great German physician, Rudolf Virchow, recently deceased, has established this proposition beyond all peradventure. Indeed it is, obviously and necessarily, the only theory of disease that is all-inclusive in its terms, and, in fact, self-evident. Its correlative is that the only effective therapeutic agents are those that reach the diseased cells and are capable of restoring them to normal activity. This is necessarily true whether the remedies are material or mental. It follows that the best remedies are those which reach the diseased locality by the most direct route and are invested with the necessary therapeutic potency, that is, the power to stimulate the diseased cells to normal activity. I submit that I have shown one potent therapeutic agent and exhibited the mechanism through which it operates, and I have shown the route over which its forces travel to reach the humblest cell in the physical organism. It is a mental power or energy. It transmits its mandates through lines composed of mind organisms, and the humblest beneficiaries of its prepotent energy are all mind organisms, intelligent entities, capable of responding to every impulse from the central intelligence. I have also shown a bodily mechanism which renders the dual mind hypothesis a biological as well as a psychological necessity to any rational theory of causation. It remains to point out the specific structure of the nerves, considered as the instruments by which therapeutic impulses are transmitted and pain inhibited. In doing so, it will first be necessary to refer again to unicellular organisms. In the amoeboid forms of life, the ciliates, rhizopods, flagellates, and others, we find that the living cell, when leading an independent existence, has the power to throw out from its protoplasmic substance projections, pseudopodia, and filaments. The very lowest animal organisms, e.g., the monera, throw out pseudopodia as a means of locomotion, and in the more highly developed protozoans these projections assume a more or less permanent character, as cilia and flagella. It is by means of these projections that unicellular creatures take cognizance of their environment, seize their food, and communicate with each other. These filaments are themselves capable of feeling and moving in response to it, and are therefore composed of living matter. Now, this power of projecting living filaments is one of the salient characteristics of the histological cells which constitute the vital units of all multicellular animal organisms. As in unicellular life, they are projected and retracted in pursuance of some want or emotion, and constitute the means of communication with neighboring cells. It is, in fact, the only means by which a sentient tissue results from their union. Moreover, it is by this means of intercommunication with each other that the millions of cells composing the body can exist as an individual animal, exhibit personality, and live, move, and have their being as one individual entity. Now, as each cell in the confederation is differentiated with a special reference to its functions, it follows that the nerve cells are more highly specialized as carriers of intelligence than any others. Hence, we find that the filaments are more distinctly in evidence in the nerve cells than in others, in that they have apparently assumed a more or less permanent character, that is to say, under the now generally accepted theory that these filaments are the substratum of the nerve system. Be this as it may, it is certain that the nerve cells project these living tentacles from cell to cell, and that in no tissue is this living connection so complete as in nerve tissue, and the gray cerebral tissue, Stevens. It is important, for more reasons than one, that we should here pause for a moment to consider this phenomenon in connection with the gray tissue of the cerebral cortex. No one needs to be told that the brain is the organ of the objective mind and the center of the cerebrospinal nervous system, or that the group of highly differentiated cells which constitutes the organ of intellect is located in the cortex, or outer surface layer or layers of the brain. The universally accepted theory is that the brain cells of the cerebral cortex constitute the storehouse of objective memory. Every cell, therefore, corresponds to some experience or thought of the individual, that is to say, for each new thought or experience of the individual, a new brain cell is developed or an old one modified. This theory is confirmed by the fact that the more highly men or the higher animals are cultivated intellectually, the more numerous are the convolutions of the brain and the deeper are the fissures, thus enlarging the cortical area and providing room for the constantly augmenting number of cells during the active or progressive life of the individual. Now, each one of these cells is in either actual or potential communication with every other cell in the cortex, by means of filaments of living protoplasmic matter akin to those already described as pertaining to the humbler cells of the bodily organism. They differ in degree of differentiation, but not in function. That is to say, these filamentary projections from cell to cell constitute the means of communicating intelligence from cell to cell, whether they are the cells of the cerebral cortex, or the nerve cells of the body, or the humbler tissue or bone cells of the outlying frontiers of the physical organism. I make these remarks here for two reasons. First, because materialistic scientists have racked their brains with an energy out of all proportion to results in an effort to solve the problem as to how sensation is communicated from cell to cell along these filamentary projections, whether by chemism, wave motion, electromotive energy, or by currents of particles of the cells themselves. And secondly, because I wish to make it clear to the reader that in dealing with man we are dealing with an intelligent entity whose whole physical organism is composed of intelligent entities, mind organisms, each one of which is endowed with intelligence proportioned to its place and function. It is, therefore, superfluous to postulate any form of energy but mental energy to account for the transmission of sensation from one cell to another. That is to say, it is obviously done by the transmission of intelligence from cell to cell by means of filaments projected from one cell until it comes in contact with its neighbor, just as ants communicate messages to each other and lay plans of cooperative action by touching each other with their antennae. Indeed, as we shall see in its proper place in this book, the communication of intelligence by means of physical contact is one of the most common of psychological phenomena. In the meantime, I desire the reader to bear in mind the fact that the communication of intelligence by means of physical contact is the prime factor of sentient life, for, I repeat it is the one means of intercommunication between cell and cell that enables the vast congeries of sentient organisms to live, move, and have their being as one. Besides, it must not be forgotten that all the cells of the human organism are descended from a single cell, the human egg cell, which, as soon as it is fertilized, multiplies by division and forms a community or colony of many social cells. These differentiate themselves, and by their specialization, by various modifications of these cells, the various tissues which compose the various organs are developed. The developed many-celled organisms of man and of all higher animals resemble, therefore, a social, civil community, the numerous single individuals of which are, indeed, developed in various ways, but were originally only simple cells of one common structure. It will thus be seen that, according to one of the highest living authorities, not only is every cell in the body descended from a single parent cell, but that all were originally, that is, before differentiation began, only simple cells of one common structure. It follows that the essential characteristics and powers remain the same in all, differing only in degree. Now, the essential characteristic of the cell is that it is a mind organism, and one of its essential powers is that of communicating with its fellow cells by means of the filaments we have described. The only question, therefore, is the impulse thus communicated from cell to cell a purely mental, intelligent impulse, or is it some form of energy known to material science as wave motion, chemism, or electromotive energy? This question is easily settled by showing that the cells of one group do communicate intelligence to each other. If this can be shown, it follows that all cells having a common origin, originally identical in structure, and possessing the same structural facilities for communicating intelligence, do the same thing in the same way. It is scarcely necessary to say that the brain cells furnish the necessary example. They have the same origin and were originally of one common structure with all the other cells of the organism. Differentiation did not change their essential nature as mind organisms. It only modified their morphological structure to adapt them to the performance of the work assigned to them, and it endowed each with the intelligence requisite to the performance of its special work. In the distribution of assignments, the brain cells were exalted to a position of regal supremacy and endowed with psychic powers commensurate with their station. But they are no more perfectly adapted to the performance of their special functions than are the others to theirs. Each is endowed with special powers, suitable and entirely adequate to the performance of its special duties. All are endowed with the instinct of self-preservation, each, in its own sphere of activity, is endowed with an intuitive knowledge of how to adapt means to ends in the conservation of life and in the repair of traumatic injuries, and all are subject to the volition of that central intelligence which, with never-sleeping vigilance, guards and guides the whole.